Hello, and welcome to Why Wars Happened, a weekly history podcast where we talk about what led to war in history. I'm your host, Emily Ross, and today we're going to be discussing the things that led to the American Revolution, with a focus on Virginia this season. We're going to start with King James I and a little background on the world he stepped into when he became the King of England in 1603. We're going to take it all the way back to the 1500s. Trust me, this is where we need to start in order to understand why England was desperate to gain more land. So, in the 1500s and everything before then, things were heated, cooked, and built with wood. Stone was used in some cases, but if you weren't living in a castle or building a city wall, your house was made out of wood and a mixture of mud and animal poop. Your day was spent toiling over the land with farm tools made out of wood, and after a long day in the field, you went inside to where your food was cooked using a wood fire. If your kids had toys, those toys were wood. If you went into town, you took your wooden wagon and you went around a bunch of wooden buildings in the town and you purchased items that were displayed on market stands made out of wood. Okay, I'm saying wood a lot, but basically, wood was everywhere. It was a part of everything, and how society functioned depended on wood. Basically, wood was life and life was wood. You couldn't live without it. So, keeping that in mind, in the 1500s, the population of England was around 2 million people, and the forest covered 9% of the land. But 500 years before that, in the year 1000, the population of England was around 1.5 million people, and the forest covered 15% of the land. That's almost twice as much. So there were only 500,000 people less in the year 1000 than there were in the year 1500. But the forest had dwindled to half of what it was in those 500 years. As you can see, the forest of England was dwindling, but it was dwindling slowly. 500 years is a long time. It must have felt like watching the ocean dry up. We got plenty of time, right? Well, sort of. That's one of the issues that we're going to talk about here. The dwindling force of England was one of the reasons that went into why England needed to gain more land. We'll get into more of that in a little bit. England had things like wood and wool and food, but being an island, England had to go elsewhere for most of the things the population needed. They also needed to sell things that they did make to other countries. So they were selling things in other places outside of England. Money was coming into England. That should be good, right? So the ideal, just like in everywhere else and pretty much all throughout time, is that a country makes enough things that people outside of that country buy it, and then money pours into your country. Sounds like a nice idea. The problem for England was that England needed wooden ships to do this. They were on an island, and everyone else was on a continent. So that took a lot of trees too. And being on an island, they couldn't even communicate with the outside world unless they used wooden ships to get that message off of the island. On top of that, wars were constant. England fought Spain, France, and other countries in Europe over and over again. Just imagine how many ships had to be built to fight the battles over those hundreds of years. And a lot of those ships ended up at the bottom of the ocean, which meant that they had to cut down more trees to build more ships for more wars. One of the most famous battles involving England in the 1500s was the Battle of the Spanish Armada. England had over 200 ships, and Spain had just over 100 ships. Think about all the wood that had to be used in the making of each of those ships. We're talking massive galleons and men of war. England completely obliterated Spain in the battle and earned its reputation as a big bad force not to be messed with. This was just 15 years before King James I began his reign in England. And James is where our story begins. Okay, let's see how the forest is holding up. In 1603, when James I sat on the English throne for the first time, the forests of England now covered only 8% of the land. 100 years before this, it had covered 9%. It was half of what it was when the Normans conquered England in 1066. At least he inherited an epic legacy where England destroyed the Spanish in a glorious high seas battle, right? Not really. That legacy didn't mean much by the time James sat on the throne. England was broke. It had involved itself in too many wars. All of the fighting had cost money that Queen Elizabeth didn't have. She had to borrow it from other people to pay her soldiers and the other costs of war. So James inherited the shiny English throne and Queen Elizabeth's debt, which was about $119 million in today's money, or $109 million in today's pounds. That debt was now his. Okay, so now that we've sprinkled a little bit more about James I in here, let's go back to England for a second. England had some of its own supplies that it could get from its soil and earth and animals, but it often went to other countries for things like spices, sugar, gunpowder, silk, wine, dyes, and other types of food that didn't grow in England. When it went to places like Norway and Sweden, sailors had to cross the infamous, very bad, no good North Sea. If you haven't seen videos of ships in the North Sea, even today with all the technology and strong metals, it's still considered one of the most dangerous places in the world. Seriously, go check out some videos. Every man who entered that sea was risking his life. He put his life in danger to gain a small reward of materials that he could bring back home. It wasn't enough to go once or twice, it was a constant need to go to dangerous places for these materials. Oh, and don't forget the icebergs. Unfortunately, even though there were men willing to risk their lives to bring home materials that the English people needed, things like the King of Denmark, who ruled the entrance to those North Waters, could stop English ships from coming in whenever he wanted. And if England still tried to get those needed materials, the King of Denmark could sick pirates or warships on them. Throughout the 1500s and 1600s, England was at war on and off with different countries. If their ships traveled anywhere in enemy territory, they risked the same capture or death, or worse, being sold into slavery. Between the 1500s and 1700s, African-based sailors are said to have captured and sold close to 1 million people into slavery. Some estimates put it higher and some put it lower. Eventually, a lot of enslaved people that were captured at sea were Americans. There's some interesting history about how we started our Navy to combat that. But that's not what this podcast is about. So basically, there were lots of dangers involved in getting basic materials for the people of England. But the forest of England was shrinking, and it was dangerous to go out and get materials that England couldn't make itself. And England was always at war, especially with France, like in particular. It's the reason we could count on France in the American Revolution to side with us against England. When a war with France flared up, trade with France became extremely difficult. An additional threat that was far less dangerous than capture or death, but it's also been known to cause wars and revolutions all by itself. I'm talking about taxes. Even outside of the dangers of war with France, in times of peace, France started taxing items that England brought to France to sell. That made it more expensive to even go to France, but England didn't really have a choice. It had to sell things outside of its own country. In addition to France, other areas of Europe had their own wars and unrest that made it difficult to trade with those places as well. England needed all these things from other places, and it was basically at the mercy of whether or not war was on, or was it off, or were these guys stable over here, or starving and desperate people in an uprising over there. And don't forget the icebergs. Okay, so now that we've covered England's supply issues, let's hop into England itself and zoom down to the everyday life of the people. England's population increased dramatically from the mid-1500s to the year 1600. That's only about 50 years, or roughly 2 or 3 generations. Think about from your grandparents to you, not a long time. In those 50 years, the population went from around 2 million people to around 4 million people, just within those 2 generations. That's a population increase of 100%. It would be like if today's U.S. population went from 350 million to 700 million in just 2 generations. Or if the UK population went from 68 million to 136 million in 2 generations. Or, if you want to think about another way, today's European population going from 742 million to 1.5 billion in 2 generations. That's crazy. It's an enormous increase in mouths to feed, people to house, people who could commit crime, and competition for the small amount of available jobs. On top of that, not only did you have to compete against a ton more people now, you also had the amount of available jobs getting smaller and smaller. Think of it like this. Think of wool, the hair that farmers shave off the backs and the sides of sheep. Wool was used to make clothes, blankets, drapes, and other cloth material. It was one of England's greatest sources of income because people from all over the world paid to have English wool shipped to them. England didn't even have to clean it or weave it or do anything to it. People bought it raw. But that also meant that England then had to turn around and buy back all the shirts and blankets and drapes and whatever else had been cleaned and woven by skilled people in other countries. England had millions of sheep, an endless supply of this woolly gold. No problem, right? If you want to make something that people are guaranteed to buy, go get yourself some sheep and some land for the sheep and you'll be rolling in coin, right? Sheep farming was a great job to have if you could get it. Not only could you sell their wool, but they also produced milk and meat that you could sell. Sounds great, totally fantastic. What's wrong with everyone just getting sheep and handing over these sheep bits for money? Well, for one thing, sheep require lots of land. So if you wanted to make more money to keep up with the high cost of things, or if you were just starting out as a strapping young sheep farmer, you needed land, lots of land. The more people who raised sheep, the more land was taken up for the raising of those sheep. And the more land for said raising of sheep made it so that there was less land for the farming of food. And I feel like there should be a savvy in there somewhere. But basically, any land that was used for anything other than growing food meant that less land was being used for growing food. Seems obvious. On top of this, the growing population meant more sheep farmers, more land being used for sheep, and more land being used for housing. Oh, and some of the food that you did grow as a sheep farmer, it was used to feed the sheep instead of people. So, okay, not so good if everyone becomes a sheep farmer. On top of that, if you're like me, then when you think of a sheep farmer or sheep herder, you think of a lonely man with his robes and his staff on a hill overlooking his flock. That's because sheep farming was not like regular farming. With regular farming, you used lots of people to break up the land, plant seeds, cut the food, and everything else that needed doing. Sheep farming uses like 1 or 2 people for the whole thing. That was one way in which things were changing in the job world and making jobs that used to be there disappear. So the amount of jobs is shrinking, the population was growing, and the amount of available food wasn't really growing with it. Not only does that mean that people will starve, it also means that the available food that is going around is going to cost a lot more. A gallon of milk might have cost a penny for your grandparents, but now it costs 10 pennies. Okay, so now you can only afford 1 gallon of milk a week. Those prices are going up, but your wages weren't really increasing with the cost of things. Kind of like today. That gallon of milk costs 10 times as much as it used to, and you're getting paid the same wage. Maybe you're getting a slightly higher wage, but certainly not 10 times the amount you used to make. So you have a growing population and less available food, and the food that is available is really pricey. So take that situation and we're going to just crank it up a notch. The larger population also meant that more people were roaming around looking for work, which means that employers could hire the person willing to work for the lowest pay. So now when you do offer your services, you're getting paid less than you used to make, not more. Oh, and that apartment you wanted to rent for you and your family, it now costs 4 times what it used to. You can forget about that. Add to that 4 years of heavy rains and bad farming seasons, and you've got a recipe for total disaster. The population had been growing so rapidly from the mid-1500s that Parliament started passing laws to deal with the issue of the poor and wandering homeless. It was thought, even back then, that local areas in your town or your village were responsible for the care of everyone who lived there. It was in the best interest of you and your family if the poor had food and shelter. This meant it was less likely that someone would rob you while you're out walking around at night. This idea has stuck around for centuries and it still applies today. We can find a lot of our current ideas about social welfare coming from the laws of medieval England. The Poor Act, as it was called, authorized representatives of the government to go around knocking door to door in each town and village and gently asking for donations for the poor who lived in the area. I say gently asking with a hint of sarcasm because the truth is if a person refused to make a donation to the poor in the area, that person would be summoned to a meeting where very important people from the local church would persuade them to make the donation. Sometimes even this didn't work, and the poor government collectors had to go back to their superiors with their tails between their legs. This long, dragged-out way of raising money for the poor lasted only about 11 years. In 1562, Parliament passed another law designed to help the poor. This one sort of kept the earlier poor law alive, but added to it that people refusing to make a payment to the poor could be brought before an actual legal judge. And if you held firm and still refused to make a donation to the poor, you could be imprisoned until you changed your mind and handed over some of your money. Keep in mind, this is while the cost of basic food and other necessary items for daily living was rising, and wages were being paid to those who would work for the least amount of pay. This may seem cruel and medieval, but it's literally the same way with taxes today. You have to pay for the social welfare of the people, and if you don't, you could get thrown in jail. Literally the same. Eventually, each town and village was required to register the names of those too old or too disabled to work. Then they would figure out how much each of those people on the list would cost to take care of for the whole year. Then they'd divide that number by the amount of people who lived in the area. And that was the amount each person would pay in donations for the poor each year. By 1601, a law was in place that made it so the local areas had to provide tools and materials to those who could work. Everybody else who could work and refused to work was simply sent to prison. Begging was specifically illegal. You could actually get into a lot of trouble for begging. Sometimes there were too many elderly or too many disabled people in an area, and the king would issue special licenses to beg. Sometimes this was for the elderly, sometimes it was for the disabled, and sometimes they gave them out to people when there were just too many people to feed from the welfare taxes. The license to beg came with a fancy metal badge that people took with them wherever they went. They could show it to an authority, and it let them know that the person had the king's permission to beg. If you were caught begging without one of these licenses, your punishment could include being whipped, having a hole burned through your ear, being branded, or, in rare cases, enslavement for a number of years. If that weren't bad enough and you continued to beg without a license, your next appointment just might be at the gallows. If those are my choices, I'll work for next to nothing and like it, thank you very much. It's safe to say that the number of poor or unemployed people in the 1500s and 1600s was a massive problem, and we haven't even gotten to the worst part of all this: crime. A growing population and large parts of that growing population being poor, and a large part of that poor being sick and desperate, a rise in crime was gonna happen. Crime by the start of the 1600s was rampant. Some estimates put the crime rates at 10 times higher than it is today. It's easy to pass that over, but really think about that. Just multiply that. For every robber you see in videos on social media, that would be 10 robbers. For every murder, 10 murders. It must have felt like the world really was coming to an end. So what's to be done? What should a government do for its people to ease their suffering? By the time King James first sat on the English throne in 1603, Europeans had been sailing to and from the Americas for over 100 years. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and spices came back. Tales of vast, untouched forests filled the minds of people who were faced with the shrinking forests of England. The New World was a bright possibility, especially for those who could lose everything if England ran out of wood, or if a king randomly started a war and said they couldn't get what they needed from other parts of the world anymore. On top of that, France, Spain, and other rival powers were already taking up land in the New World. Why should England sit on the sidelines when there were endless unoccupied lands there for the taking? It would solve all of their problems of being at the mercy of enemy countries, of running out of wood, and of not having their own soil grow enough food. It would even help stop their enemies from gaining some of that unoccupied land and becoming more powerful. Why should they not reach out and take it? Well, the problem, of course, was that the land was not unoccupied. Natives in the Americas had been living there for thousands of years, warring, killing, conquering, and building their own civilizations. England and the rest of Europe were well aware of this, but to them, vast forests with no roads or buildings or towns was something the natives and the Europeans couldn't resist but take if they felt they were stronger than those who already lived there. This isn't a justification for the genocide and brutality that the natives suffered. This is to try and get into the minds of the people who came over. It was out of a sense of personal desperation and survival of the country that English colonists immigrated to the Americas and set up the first permanent English colony in 1607. This colony was Jamestown, and it was named after their king, James. There was also a sense of adventure that had built up in Europe. It was the age of discovery and exploration. But the main reason the immigrants came to Jamestown was the hope of producing wood, iron, and gold for England. Shiploads of country-saving wealth should be pouring in at any moment, ready to shine a light on the bleak existence they were falling into. Well, such hopes and dreams were met with bitter disappointment. That's all for today. Thanks for tuning in. Join us next week when we discuss who King James was and his motivations for colonization. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, and comment your thoughts on this episode below. See you next time on Why Wars Happened.